So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to our Simon Wiesenthal lecture in June. We have with us Jack Fairweather, and it's a great pleasure for me. I'm Jochen Böhler. I'm the director of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Jack to you. We haven't met here for the first time, but it's wonderful to see you again, Jack, here in Vienna. And maybe I start with Simon Wiesenthal lectures that we do. The Simon Wiesenthal lectures present state-of-the-art research to a broader audience, and the guests we invite are often with a mixed biography which combines historical research with other professions. And this is exactly the case with Jack as well. Jack was born and raised in Great Britain and educated in Oxford, and is the best-selling author of the book The Volunteer, which won the Costa Prize. It's the account of Witold Pilecki, a Polish underground officer who volunteered to report on Nazi crimes in Auschwitz. And the book has been translated into 25 languages and has formed the basis of a large exhibition in Berlin, and that's where we met. But this was the book before, yeah? And now we are talking about the book to come. So we are really honored, Jack, that you are here to present your next book project that I will name in a second. But so Jack has not been trained in the traditional way as an historian with the PhD and then a chair or so, but he had a completely different life. He was an embedded journalist with the armies in Iraq and in Afghanistan. He lived in Baghdad and in Istanbul, and now you're living in the States, as far as I remember, because sometimes it's hard to keep track. I cite here from your website, as the violence escalated in Iraq, Jack was fortunate to survive a suicide bomb attack, a kidnapping attempt, and almost daily mortar attacks around their house. So that's a little bit different from my life, for example. Yeah. So But Jack has, beside of reporting for major newspapers and journals like the Daily Telegraph, published a couple of books. The Volunteer was one of them. Another one was A War of Choice, the British in Iraq, published in 2003. Published in 2012. And the Good War, Why We Couldn't Win the War or the Peace in Afghanistan. It's also a very timely book, I would say, but was already published in 2014. Then came The Volunteer, and now that's the book project that Jack is going to talk about tonight. And the title of his lecture is, as you can see, The Trials of Fritz Bauer, of course a name that is known to most of us here from our own work, How Life as a Gay Jewish Socialist under the Nazis Shaped His Quest for Justice. Jack, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jochen, and I think all good talks should start with a confession, and my confession is this is the first time I've given it. In fact, I actually just sent off the manuscript last week, so I'm a little frazzled, but I knew as soon as Jochen said, would you come and speak at the Wiesenthal Center, that it was something I really wanted to do, because I think, like all of us in this room, we've been watching events unfold around us in Europe and seen this sort of heightened political situation, and for me, as someone who lives now in the States, writing about post-war justice, writing about Fritz Bauer, I've been, watching with concern with events unfolding, and so I'm so pleased to get to speak to all of you and hear your thoughts, because you're sort of living here, and I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of this lecture. So, I'd like to start by having you all picture a scene with me. It's the summer of 1948. A train is entering Germany at the Danish border at Padborg. On board is a small man in a neatly tailored suit with a careworn look. He hands over his travel papers to the British Guard at the customs post. They reveal his name, Fritz Bauer, his occupation, former district judge from Stuttgart, currently unemployed. His nationality, stateless. His religion, Jewish. He's heading back to Germany after 12 years of exile for a job interview to become Attorney General in the small city of Braunschweig. It's a modest position. He'll potentially run an office of a dozen prosecutors as the German justice system reestablishes itself amidst the rubble. What Bauer doesn't say to the border guard, or even his closest friends and family, is there's a deeper reason for his returning. He's got a radical idea that he already knows is going to set himself against the country he's returning to. He's watched the Allies impose their vision of justice on Germany, and he knows it's not gone far enough. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, declared in 1945 that only Hitler and his inner circle could be considered responsible for the Nazis' crimes. 22 men were convicted at Nuremberg the following year, and a few thousand more in follow-up trials and through denazification proceedings. The Allies believe that justice has been served. Their attention is shifting to the Cold War, and most Germans are ready to move on. In their haste to re-establish the justice system, the Allies have stacked the courts with Nazi-era judges. Already sentences for war criminals are growing more lenient, and the numbers of investigations are dropping. Bauer knows this isn't justice, because it's failed to address the nature of the Nazis' crimes or the scale of German complicity. Hitler had enlisted the German people in a national effort to persecute, plunder, and finally kill the entirety of Europe's Jews. 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party. Over 250,000 had served in the SS that operated the death camps of Auschwitz, or Birkenau in Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor, and staffed the Einsatzgruppen murder squads. Tens of thousands of soldiers had committed atrocities on the front lines. Countless civil servants had participated in the vast bureaucratic machinery of industrialized murder. And yet most of these people had simply slipped back into German society and resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. So let's go back to the train. Bauer's idea, incomplete and seemingly impossible, is to use the justice system to force a national reckoning. He wanted to prosecute Nazis in the courts, hold their crimes up to scrutiny, expose the roots of Nazism in German culture, and, if possible, expunge them. What are the chances of Bauer achieving that? He knew he would have to struggle to win any convictions when half of the city's judges had served under Hitler. The chief prosecutor of Braunschweig had approved the killing of 15,000 mentally ill patients as part of a Nazi euthanasia program. Over at police headquarters, the chief police officer was a former SS officer who had deported Poles from Krakow to Auschwitz. One of his staff had murdered the Jews in Łódź ghetto. And should Bauer succeed in bringing his cases to court, were his fellow Germans prepared to listen to him of all people, a Jew, a camp survivor, and, should it ever emerge, a gay man? Any one of these identities might incite his fellow countrymen to ostracize him, to vilify him, or worse. Looking around that train, Bauer must have wondered who among those other passengers had killed or watched others kill women like his aunt or children like his nephew. Who among them would still wish him harm? Somehow, Bauer was going to have to hide his own past while persuading a hostile court system to expose the pasts of others and convince a tired, skeptical country to listen. We often take for granted Germany's role today as a bastion of constitutional, liberal democracy, if, albeit, under current threat, and a country that has fully confronted its past to ensure the crimes of the Nazis will never be forgotten. We also take for granted our knowledge of the Holocaust as it's commemorated each year, taught in schools and universities and at centres like the Wiesenthal Centre, told and retold in films and books. Holocaust survivors are honoured and their memories recorded for posterity. But to sit on that train with Bauer in 1948 is to realise that a different future was possible, one in which the genocide of Europe's Jews is not seen as the defining event of the Second World War or of our collective human history, one in which Germany, far from being a settled democracy, never rids itself of the authoritarian and militaristic thinking that had led to Nazism. That's why I think Bauer's story is so vital for us to consider today. I first came across his story while writing my last book, The Volunteer, about Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who infiltrated Auschwitz to report on the horrors of the camp. Pilecki's story raised the question of why the world would look away from the crimes of the Nazis. Bauer asks us a different question. What made the world confront the Holocaust? How do you change a culture that's in denial about its past? And how do you persuade people to recognize their own intolerance and prejudice? The past 5 years, I've been researching and writing a book about Bauer. It's due to be published next year by Penguin Random House, entitled The Prosecutor. It tells the extraordinary story of how Bauer effectively infiltrated the West German justice system, doggedly, daringly, defiantly, set about using the courts to force a national reckoning. Upon returning to Braunschweig, Bauer was first to battle with public indifference. He might be able to prosecute a few low-level Nazi war criminals, but no one was paying attention. So what does he do? He brilliantly takes on the leader of one of Germany's first post-war neo-Nazi parties that's been rapidly rising in the polls. He sues him for slander in 1952 and wins, and seizes national attention that helps him gain promotion to Frankfurt in 1955. Now he has a larger stage for pursuing Nazi war criminals. Indeed, he manages to track down one of the greatest, Adolf Eichmann. He knows that Eichmann is well connected, and if he tries to extradite him to West Germany, the SS men in government or in the police will likely tip him off. So what does Bauer do? He secretly enlists Eichmann's capture with the help of the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, leading to a trial in Jerusalem that will lodge the Holocaust in our collective consciousness. But Bauer still hasn't made his fellow Germans recognize their own complicity in Eichmann's crimes. And now his task has gotten harder because with increased visibility, he's attracted the attention of the West German security forces who are determined to stop him going after influential Nazis in the government, not least Hans Globke, one of the chief implementers of the Nuremberg race laws, who is now right-hand man to the Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Bauer is put under surveillance. He's threatened. Witnesses are intimidated and bought off. Evidence goes missing. There's a mole in his office. In the middle of this, he pulls off his boldest and most shocking move. He puts Auschwitz itself on trial to reveal how ordinary Germans made mass murder possible. I describe Bauer's remarkable mission in the book, but the more I explored his public achievements, I found myself wondering what drove Bauer to set himself against West German society? What gave him this unwavering focus on the past? And at what cost did this single-mindedness come? And what struck me as I began my research was the extent to which Bauer's public role as Attorney General in post-war Germany required him to hide his own story. The very experiences of persecution under the Nazis that shaped Bauer's vision and sustained his pursuit of justice could be used against him to undermine his position, his mission. Bauer knew that if he talked about being persecuted as a socialist or about surviving the Holocaust, he risked being dismissed as a vengeful Jew. He knew that if any detail of his homosexuality emerged, he might find himself prosecuted under the country's anti-gay laws. Bauer's masking was an act of self-preservation, but this need for secrecy poses a challenge for any biographer. How do you uncover a past which has been very deliberately kept secret? Bauer published a great deal on the need for a national reckoning, but very few private papers survived that might suggest how he came to terms with his own past. The first sources I consulted were the fantastic biographies of Irmtrude Voyak and Roland Steinke, which some of you may be aware of, I'm sure, and of course the brilliant scholarship of Werner Renz. No book can be written about Bauer without consulting their work. I remember being struck by a story Voyak told me about the difficulties I would face in uncovering Bauer's hidden life. She recounted a conversation she had had with Bauer's nephew, Rolf Tiefenthal. He'd sat with Bauer's wife towards the end of her life. When she was going blind, she had a stack of Bauer's letters. She asked Rolf to read them one by one and then told him to toss them in the fire. Daunting task for a biographer, especially because I knew I wanted to tell Bauer's story in the style of narrative nonfiction. I wanted to recreate the world that Bauer experienced, to help readers understand his experience. I know this approach is sometimes questioned by classically trained historians, but for me it's an important means to help readers engage with the past. I also found narrative nonfiction to be a powerful method for discovery, because to describe a scene vividly requires hundreds of details that can only be found in primary sources, newspapers, letters, journals, or through interviews, or by visiting the scenes of the story. So I want to share with you this evening how I uncovered Bauer's secret life of persecution under the Nazis. I believe is crucial for understanding where Bauer's vision comes from and how it sustained him. So I'm going to ask you to picture another scene with me. It's March 1933, shortly after the Nazis' rise to power. Bauer is 29. He's a district judge in Stuttgart, an activist for the Social Democratic Party, and an outspoken critic of Hitler. You can't quite see it so well, but it's one of my favorite pictures of Bauer, which I've got from the family and haven't seen elsewhere. It's him just shortly after taking up his job as a judge, and quite different in many ways to that sort of staid image we have of Bauer, white hair. There we go. So on March the 23rd, Bauer is seized from the courthouse where he works, along with several other 1,000 political prisoners from the state of Württemberg. He's brought to Heuberg, one of the Nazis' first concentration camps. This is the Nazi propaganda picture showing the SS garrison a few days before Bauer's arrival. And it's worth pointing out that this is many years before the Nazis conceived of the final solution. And at this stage, they were only seeking to crush the political opposition. Bauer rarely, if ever, spoke about what happened to him here. In an interview in 1964, during the Auschwitz trial, a journalist quoted him as saying that whenever he went past Heuberg, he stopped his car, would get out to pay his respects to the camp's victims, leading to an immediate backlash in the media. When a fellow survivor contacted Bauer a few years later to ask him if he'd like to attend a survivors' reunion, he pointedly didn't answer. So what happened to Bauer in the camp? The first step was to trawl through dozens of survivor accounts, looking for traces of Bauer. My researchers Florin Mietz and Anna Schneider found a reference to him being held in Barrack Block. All right, well, I'm going to have to ask you to re-picture being back in Heuberg, which I appreciate we probably wanted to leave as much as Bauer did. But anyway, this is present-day Heuberg and the very block that Bauer was held in that we were able to discover. And it was then that we found the account of a communist prisoner who arrived in the camp on the same day as Bauer, who described how he and Bauer were taken to an attic of Barrack 19A. And one at a time, they were subject to the most vicious and brutal of beatings. This is the room where Bauer was repeatedly beaten. How did this affect him? Well, extraordinarily, it turns out he was interviewed by an American correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, Edmund Taylor, a few days later. Goebbels had invited Taylor to Heuberg to prove it was a, quote, normal camp. So it's just the most extraordinary scene of Bauer being sort of tidied up and sat down in front of this American correspondent who wanted, presumably, to believe the Nazi line. At least he didn't comment on Bauer's condition. Taylor asks him, "What's the worst feature of prison life for you?" These are Bauer's words inside the camp. "The worst," says Bauer, "is the feeling that my life has crumbled to pieces under me. I feel mentally crushed. I am beaten by my environment." Why is it important to capture this moment in Bauer's life? Because the Nazis' program of mass murder required, as a first step, the dehumanization of their victims. And it's this feeling of having his selfhood stripped away that's going to drive Bauer's outrage on behalf of the millions who died at the Nazis' hands. Here's another picture which is not typically known of Bauer, also from the family. This is him shortly after his release from Heuberg, sitting on the veranda of his parents' apartment in Stuttgart. And you wouldn't know the horrific experiences that he has been through, although there's a certain sort of wariness to him, I would say. The next scene I'd like to introduce you to is seminal to his experience as a Holocaust survivor. So I'm going to ask you to picture another scene. This time it's October 1943 in Copenhagen. Bauer's whole family has joined him in exile. His elderly parents, his sister, her husband, and their 2 boys. Here's another very touching picture of Bauer with his 2 nephews, Rolf and Peter. Adolf Eichmann has ordered the roundup of all Jews in Denmark for their deportation to the camps. By this stage, the mass murder of Jews has reached industrial proportions. New gas chambers in Auschwitz recently opened with the capacity to exterminate 5,000 Jews at once. Bauer doesn't know the details of the extermination program at this stage, but he knows that if he and his family are caught, they're likely to be killed. In a rare interview about his time in exile, Bauer gives journalist Liselotte Maas a few details of his escape via a fishing boat from the small Danish port of Rørvig. In later years, Bauer's nephew, Rolf Wiesenthal, also describes the rescue, how the family were sheltered in a broom cupboard in Rørvig while the fishing boat was arranged, and how they'd been forced to hide in the boat's hull for most of the 8-hour crossing to safety in Sweden. So with my Danish researcher, Signe Winter, and we were able to track down the address where Bauer stayed and find the woman who sheltered Bauer and his family, Ingeborg Johansson. Here she is outside the house where they stayed. And with the help of a local historian, Bo Braystrup, we met the grandchildren of Ingeborg. And here we are in the house nearby. This is, for me, as a researcher, one of my absolute favorite moments of the work, and that's getting to meet family members, whether survivors or rescuers in this case, and hear them speak about their activities of the family. Johanssons did not know that their grandma had rescued Fritz Bauer. They had vaguely heard about his mission, subsequent mission in West Germany, so I got to share with them that story. There's Bo Braystrup, the local historian. To the right, actually, is another amazing interview, but that's for another talk, Helle Wagner. And I come to this meeting from just talking to Helle, and we'd had a cup of tea, and she said, "Fritz Bauer, I have got a box full of his letters in my attic. I've never gone through them. Would you like to have a look?" I was like, wow, yes. So anyway, that's all sort of revealed in the book, this amazing friendship and love that he had for Helle's father, Paul. When I first started speaking to these lovely ladies, they couldn't remember any details. They were like, "Oh, Grandma said this, that. I don't think she spoke about the rescue." But then it's happened to me many times as a oral historian. One will say a little detail that feeds another memory, that feeds another. And it soon turned out that between all three of them, they actually did know the story of how their grandmother had rescued the Bauer family, and how the exact route that she had led them through the Huysans forest to a nearby beach in Diazabo. That path was still there today. So shortly after speaking to them, we all set off at a trot. It was getting dark. In fact, it was about the same time of year and the same time of evening when Bauer and his family set off through these woods. And the grandchildren remembered a story that the grandmother had said, which was just around about here. They were walking in single file, the mother, Ingeborg, leading, or the grandmother leading, Bauer and his family in single file, everything they owned on their backs, utterly exposed to the world at the height of the Holocaust, and a German guard walks towards them in this gathering light. He brushes past them, and then he keeps on going. And for me, that was just an extraordinary moment to realize the sort of proximity of the crime for Bauer and his family, and to think indeed about what that experience must have been like. This is the point on the coast where they were rescued by the fishermen, and the boat pulled up. It's quite a sort of steep draft there, so they had to sort of wade through the water to get on board the boat. And this is the last wooden fishing boat in Røvig, and I was just a short of a clip, and the local sea captain, who was quite a roguish character, which actually gave me another little insight into Bauer's experience, because we asked him, "Oh, would you take us out on the boat?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, for 500 kroner." And then he was like, "What's it for?" And said, "Oh, we wanted to, see a wooden, fishing boat in action and sort of understand what the crossing was like." And he was like, "Oh, well, that would be 1,000 kroner then," because he realized he had the only wooden fishing boat in the port. And then by the time we finally showed up, he was like, "You know what? This is going to be 2,000 kroner." It's like, well, whatever. Which, in a weird, strange twist of fate, was actually the amount that Bauer and his family also had to pay. I didn't tell the man that. got fleeced and took our crossing. But anyway, that's the side story. What we also managed to do was track down the real sea captain who would rescue Bauer's family and meet his son. Here he is, Live Muller, who told us about the type of boat, told us about his father's experience of taking Bauer across the ocean. And this is a really special photograph for me because the woman standing next to Live Muller is, in fact, Marit Wiesenthal, who is Bauer's great niece and who's the closest relative to Bauer. And it was a real sort of privilege, having sort of discovered the route of Bauer's escape, to be able to tell her about it and invite her to come and meet the sea captain and share in that story of rescue together. So why is it important to describe this moment in Bauer's life? Because I think, as in Heuberg, we see Bauer brought to a point of maximum vulnerability. But this time, it leads directly to the turning point when his fear, his terror, and his sense of humiliation are transformed into his mission for justice. Because a few months later in Stockholm, in January 1944, still recovering from his escape, Bauer attends a talk given by a fellow exile, Max Hoden. Hoden's just met a Jewish survivor from Poland who's given him details for the first time of the industrialized mass murder of Jews in gas chambers. And Hoden shares those experiences with the audience. These are the facts, says Hoden. Mere protest is no longer enough. You can understand that Bauer leaves that room, I think, in a state of shock. But then, the very next day, he begins to work on a book that's going to become his mission statement. And he has the idea that the only way that Germany will accept responsibility for its crimes is for Germans to prosecute those crimes themselves. That's the vision that Bauer carried with him on the train in 1948 as he headed back to Germany to confront his fellow citizens with what they had done. That's the vision that made Bauer create a platform for survivors to speak of their experiences in Jerusalem and Frankfurt. He turned his personal experiences into a public mission, and in the process confronted Germany and the rest of the world with the horrors of the Holocaust. The irony, of course, is that Bauer could not share his own story, not with the public, and not with his closest friends. And there's an added poignancy here, because as a gay man, Bauer struggled to find love and someone with whom he could share his burden. I write about Bauer's personal experiences because they help us understand the price he had to bear for keeping his vision, and help us understand his true legacy for us today. Bauer never lived to see the world he was fighting for, but his story shows us the struggle involved in forging a more tolerant society. I think it's also a reminder of how fragile those gains can be. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, for the lecture, and apologies again for the technical problems we faced, and luckily we could master. Thank you for your talk and for introducing and inviting us into the world of Fritz Bauer, and also maybe a little more about crossing a line where historians sometimes shy away into the world of emotions and of how events can shape people. And what I really liked about your talk and the way you are working, and is intriguing, leads me to my first question, is something I've also seen by reading East-West Street of Philip Sands. I find it really fascinating, this literary approach of combining the historical work and carving out the facts from the files, yeah? And combining that also with the search itself. Now, you make the search for the evidence on what you write about and on Fritz Bauer and his life and his mission, with the search for it and with what came after it, with the children, grandchildren, niece, and so on. I find it really fascinating, because on the one hand it shows us how you are working, and sometimes this is quite different from the typical historian like me, for example, does. For me, for a long time, everything outside an archive would not exist. Yeah, but what you show us is that you can find so much more evidence when you leave also this safe space of the archive. Yeah, you go to the archive and they say what's not in the archive, that's not there. That's not there. Yeah. And by your work and your writing, you show us also in your book itself how it can be done differently. Yeah? And yeah, I find that very, very, very fascinating. My question to you is, you have talked, and I found it very impressive at the beginning, about the wall of denial and also the attempts to stop Fritz Bauer in his investigation. Yeah, and we have persons like Fritz Bauer, we have persons like Simon Wiesenthal, we have persons like Jan Zehn. You have also done research on him, the so-called Polish Fritz Bauer and their mission. And we see these single individuals, and then we see this wall of the societies that don't want to be investigated. Yeah? And these individuals force them to do that. Yeah? And you've done really deep digging, not only in the life and what you could find on Fritz Bauer, but also on these societies I mean, there is this saying of Fritz Bauer that when he leaves his office, it's enemy territory. Yeah, you have to imagine this expression. And I would like you to maybe, can you tell us a little more about this wall and about this society and about this pressure against him that you found? I mean, I think sometimes it's really numbing and must be really hard for somebody like him to fight against it. How did you find the representation of the society that he had to face, and he tried to make look into the mirror?
I think there's a very poignant anecdote told by Heinz Mayr-Welde, who was Bauer's sort of closest friend in Braunschweig, about how early on in his time in the city, Mayr-Welde is in a bookshop, antiquarian bookshop, and he sort of sees a couple of judges in the back of the room, and he hears them talking about Bauer, saying, "Oh yeah, we should have guessed him too." And he obviously relays this to Bauer, and I mean, we can only imagine what effect that would have on us to be so hated in our workplace. I mean, Bauer had this experience many times. I think, we get to see that as we follow his life play out in the stress that he experienced, various breakdowns that I got to write about, I think, in some ways for the first time during the Auschwitz trial, which I think, isn't really appreciated before, this sort of pressure that he was under. Of course, we know that he died prematurely, almost certainly through overwork, through the stress that he was under, through a heart attack. And, I think understanding his life, confronting this society that, as you say, did not want to face the past, was incredibly personally tiring on him. what I would say, because you mentioned Simon Wiesenthal and Janssen, is that Bauer had, a really special gift for finding, as he would call them, comrades who could share some of this burden with him in their own ways. I mean, they often work quite alone, as you know with Simon Wiesenthal and with Janssen, but together they provided this sort of network of contacts that was able to trade information across the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War, to be able to bring evidence from Poland to Frankfurt, that was able to find the witnesses that they ultimately needed to speak against the crimes of the Nazis. And I think Bauer had a gift for finding those people and enabling them. And so the book is called The Prosecutor, and I'm conscious that in telling this sort of red thread of his life to you, it's very focused on Bauer, but what I've tried to do in the book is show this community of activists and survivors and prosecutors with whom he worked to try and bring about these great trials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But can you tell a little bit more on the immediate environment of Fritz Bauer in Frankfurt when he was doing the preparations for the Auschwitz trial? He must have had also his cooperators and people that he could rely on. You said you were talking about a mole in his office, but there must have been also a kind of Fritz Bauer team, because otherwise it would just not have been possible. So you have, on the one hand, you have this society and this resistance against it, but you must have some people that you can really count on, I guess. No?
Yeah, and it was, I think one of my real joys was to get to write in full about the young prosecutor that Bauer became a sort of symbol of his team, Joachim Kugler, who did so much to track down the different Nazi Auschwitz guards who were scattered across Germany. He was the guy who tracked them down. He spent years every day interviewing survivors, building these cases, and I think it was really important to be able to tell the story of the Auschwitz story, to really recognize that Kugler and Vogel and the rest of the prosecution's team role in executing Bauer's vision. And for those of you who know the story of Kugler, I mean, he had some tensions with Bauer, and I think the two men became sadly disillusioned with each other, and but I don't think that in any way detracts from the work that both men did together. And it's impossible to mention the Auschwitz trial without mentioning Hermann Langbein, who was an Austrian communist who had been in Auschwitz and played an absolutely seminal role contacting witnesses. And I think, as a writer who tries to connect with the human experience of the story, I think I wanted to tell survivor stories and show what it took for a survivor to come to Frankfurt from Poland, from Czech Republic, from Israel, from the US, to, for the first time since the war, speak to German authorities about their experiences. I wanted to capture that experience of being a survivor in the courtroom, where they had to sit, talk about the most intimate acts of violence carried out against them and their family, whilst the defendants, the men who carried it out, sat as close as we are together. That is just the most extraordinary moment for me in post-war German history. I mean, in our collective human history, that act of confrontation. And Hermann Langbein, it would not have been possible without him, because he was someone who talked to these witnesses and said, Bauer is okay. This is necessary for us to finally bring justice to the victims of the camps. And there's another story that I also wanted to weave in. And of course, Henry Ormond, an amazing Frankfurt lawyer, who had done so much work before Bauer got to Frankfurt to recognize the sort of plight of survivors of the camp and seek compensation for them, and who had this extraordinary idea, crazy idea, which was in 1964, when the Auschwitz trial was sort of going a little bit off kilter and was not delivering what Bauer wanted, and it seemed like very much the wrong message was emerging from the trial from his perspective. Ormond had this idea, which is I still find it completely bonkers, but let's bring the court to Auschwitz. Let's bring the world's attention to Auschwitz. Never mind it's the height of the Cold War. Never mind all of the logistical difficulties. Never mind that the last time a German judge walked in session on Polish soil was as a special court judge delivering summary executions on Polish citizens. Saying all that aside, let's bring the trial to Auschwitz. And of course, it was an extraordinary moment, I think, which in some ways answers or brings us to this point in which German society was confronted by Auschwitz, because it was not possible to look away. The journalists, the reporters were literally there at the gates of the gas chambers. So there was no chance for denial in that moment. And that's, I think, really, just this extraordinary collaboration between Bauer and Ormond and Langbein, Kugler and Vogel, and this whole team that he brought together. Of course, the witnesses too, who brought German society to confront the Auschwitz and bring it to us today.
Your book that is going to be published at the beginning of next year, I guess, no? It's not the first book on Fritz Bauer. No? On the other hand, you have just shown us an impressive investigative work that you have done that surely has unearthed a lot of new sources and testimonies and so on. So how would you characterize your book in as what it's bringing new to the topic of Fritz Bauer to the audience to read?
Yes, well, I think, as I said during the talk, it's not possible to write a book about Fritz Bauer without, just observing the incredible scholarship of Irmtrud Woyak, who, spent the best part of a decade in the archives, meeting family and friends, and her book is, a massive compendium of material on Bauer. So I'm incredibly grateful to her. I think Ron Steinke has done such an incredible job as a sort of public historian, being able to examine some of these chapters of Bauer's life that I think bear special scrutiny: his Jewishness, his homosexuality, his gay life, the cost of his work to himself personally. I think what the power of narrative nonfiction is to be able to bring together all of these sources and to place the reader in Bauer's perspective. And I think it's incredibly important to do this because as a historian, we of course have the benefit of hindsight. It's very easy to make judgments. It's very easy to sort of hide in some ways behind the facts. And what I wanted to do and what I wanted to share with readers was what it was like for Bauer in that moment to make these decisions, because that, for me, is how we can really learn from him, understand his moral vision, understand the choices that he made. And I think, for me at least, and hopefully for readers of the book, really inspire us today with those, with that courage of his, that defiance in the face of a society that didn't want to listen. And there's much there for us to learn, but I think only if we're prepared to embrace his experience as it unfolded for him.
Thank you for very inspiring talks. I have two questions. One is a bit smaller. So you might be aware that in Germany we had two films on Fritz Bauer. So The Labyrinth of Silence, and the other one is The Life of Fritz Bauer. So I think about 10 years now we're talking about his homosexuality. And my second question is a bit more complicated. Fritz Bauer was attorney in Braunschweig. Braunschweig was the city of Otto Ernst Rehmer. Rehmer is the guy who arrested Klaus Count Stauffenberg on the 20th of July and shot him in the end. So Rehmer became a hero in Nazi times, and after the war he started a new Nazi party, SRP, and tried to, and he had particular acceptance of his Nazi views. That was around, I think, 51. And one of the first things Fritz Bauer does in Braunschweig is trying to stop Otto Ernst Rehmer and making clear that Rehmer is the high treason guy to his country and not Stauffenberg. So what position has the Rehmer trial in your book?
Good question. So, well, let's talk about Rehmer first of all. This is, of course, the first great trial of Bauer upon his return to Germany. So I treat it at length to really capture what it was like to be in that city when Rehmer is giving his speeches, to capture Bauer's vision for how he would plan to use this trial to expose the sort of fundamental injustice of the German state and to make this point that everyone had a duty to resist. And that, of course, exonerates Stauffenberg and means that he's not a traitor. In fact, he is following the highest moral principle in fighting against Hitler. And of course, this was a hugely controversial topic in West Germany at the time, and you know, I think I'm going to mention it very briefly in the talk, of course, because this is the brilliance of Bauer. He's got to somehow hack the system. Like, he shows up in Braunschweig, people are saying probably should gas the Jews. He's struggling with his court of Nazi judges to get even sort of lower apparatchiks sort of put before the courts. No one's paying any attention. And here he goes straight after Rehmer and captures national attention. And I think Bauer's genius is that he takes a very innocuous prosecution for slander of something that Rehmer said, and he's able to show Germany the big issues, unpack that in this incredibly powerful closing speech that he gives as the prosecutor. And I really loved building the scene for the readers, because I think it just adds something more to know that as Bauer is talking, he's got Rehmer to his right. The front row of the gallery was with 25 members of the Socialist Reich Party who had been sitting there throughout the trial, sort of eyes boring into Bauer. And there is Bauer just delivering this incredibly powerful speech that sort of sets the national agenda, and of course becomes, in many ways, his calling card for leads to his promotion to Frankfurt and the next step in his career. So I hope that somewhat answers your question, but I think of course it's really important to tell that story. There are so many little facets of it as well, which that Bauer went to the same school as Stauffenberg, and they sort of knew each other. That Bauer, in fact, I tracked down a letter he wrote in 1944 in which he'd actually spoken to some of the plotters who had escaped to Sweden. And he did not have a very high opinion of them. He knew very well that Stauffenberg and others like him had very dangerous views from his perspective, that they had supported the invasion of Poland, that they believed in the Greater German Reich, that their real reason for, trying to kill Hitler was to try and preserve the Reich for as long as possible. It wasn't because of the mass murder of Europe's Jews, which featured fairly low down.
Some of the 44 conspiracies had been participating in the war of annihilation in the East. Yeah.
So I think that helps us also see this side of Bauer, which is, this calculation, this political brilliance of this man who has he's got this very narrow path to walk. From that moment he gets off that train in Braunschweig, it's a narrow path he has to walk in which will allow him to catch the attention of West German society. And it's that path that takes him from Braunschweig to Frankfurt, to Eichmann, and on to Auschwitz. So that's part of his brilliance. Your question about Bauer's gay life, I think, is a really important one. We know about Bauer's gay life, and the answer is about as stark as you can possibly imagine, which is contained in the Danish police records, because when Bauer first fled to Copenhagen in 1936, he was put on surveillance by the Danish police, who then, in the grotesque and disturbing manner, followed him step by step during his various liaisons with young men. So we have a very intimate understanding of Bauer's gay life. I think possibly it's been difficult to write about it because of this, I think, a sort of misunderstanding about what gay life was like for men in the 30s. Much of it was transactional between what Bauer would have called a rent boy, we would call a sex worker, because it was not possible, even in somewhere like Denmark, where there had been a degree of liberalization around gay laws, it was not possible to live as a gay man societally, and of course, Bauer, it was a moment actually, I think, that really gave me insight into him with this leading Danish historian of sort of gay life in Copenhagen. We went step by step through all of the files, examining Bauer's contacts with these sex workers. And the first one he meets, it's really fascinating because, which says something really special, I think, about Bauer, which is that most of these transactions took place in the park or in the urinals, because of course, that was how it was done. Bauer, during this hookup, his first hookup in Copenhagen, upon reaching there, takes this young man and says, "Come back to my apartment." And it's a very small little gesture, but it actually immediately, it stood out to this gay historian, stood out to me, because it's so different to how other, how the sort of standard norm. And it was a huge risk to Bauer, because of course blackmail was a huge problem in the gay community then, because these sex workers, rent boys, would blackmail their clients. And Bauer took a chance with this young man and took him back to his apartment, and so thus began a relationship, a very striking relationship that I write about in the book, because it felt important to me to share that side of Bauer. Also to know that the reason why we know about it today is, of course, because he was trailed back to that apartment. A policeman was hiding in the bushes as he and this young man entered the bedroom together. I mean, I think, it's a challenge as a biographer to know, someone who wants to bring us into Bauer's life to also know when to step back. But I did want to write about his gay life, partly to show us how he saw intimacy in his own life, which I think is always important for us as humans, but also to show some of the sacrifices he had to make upon his return to West Germany, because there, indeed, the many Nazi-era laws that were stripped away by the Allies, they left a few in place. One of them was the Nazi-era anti-gay legislation that made, had been designed by Himmler to make any form of contact between men prosecutable, basically, and it was a very, very difficult situation for Bauer. As the Attorney General, he had to oversee prosecutions of gay men in Braunschweig, which is something I write about in the book. Because what a terrible moral conundrum he placed himself in. And I actually was able, I think for the first time really, to write about Bauer's early gay advocacy work, which is really extraordinary, because to think that at the same time he's going after Raymer, he's also trying to figure out how to repeal Article 175. His ambition is great. And I think that's one of the reasons why I admire Bauer so much. And I also wanted to show his place in the early gay rights movement in post-war West Germany, because it's been hidden. And that for me seems a shame. And I think Bauer, it's a sort of question that you sometimes have with the subject of your biography. How would Bauer feel about this? And I think taking the bigger picture of his work, it wasn't simply for there to be a reckoning for Nazi crimes. He wanted German culture itself to open up. He wanted it to be the case that gay men could find love and not be persecuted for it. And he didn't live to see that, and he didn't get to find sort of meaningful love, although he did have moments I write about in the book where he found connection. But I think that adds a sort of another layer to his work, and so and indeed his success in many ways, because of course, as we know, German society is now much more open. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask a question about what were the issues or the points where you thought while researching, I have to find out that, and it was not possible?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, that's such a great question. Just running through the manuscript I just sent off through my mind. I think, of course, almost every page you have those sort of challenges. I think there was one aspect of his gay life that I really spent so long trying to discover with Sina, my researcher, and that was this Danish man, Erik Kai Olsen, who he moved in with for a time in Copenhagen. It's captured a little bit in the police records, and so we looked everywhere for Erik Kai Olsen, knowing that this was a really close, intimate relationship. Indeed, there's like a sort of cache of letters by Bauer, a very rare resource, which very few people have actually gone through, partly because they're written in Sutelin, which is an absolute nightmare to go through, in which Bauer is actually, he's using Erik Kai Olsen's name as his own, as a sort of code name. So he's sort of receiving letters from Stuttgart and which suggests a real intimacy. And there's another letter in which one of his very good friends from Stuttgart writes to him, which is another little tantalizing detail in which he says, "Oh, your mum's told me about the young man who stays with you. I'm very jealous," and which raised this idea, or maybe did Bauer's mum know about his sexuality, which I mean, we can't sort of know for sure, but it sort of, connects this intimate circle for Bauer. And sadly, we weren't able to find Erik Kai Olsen's name. We really went through like cemetery records across Denmark looking for him without luck. But maybe when I get to, bring the talk to Denmark, and I'll start mentioning Erik Kai Olsen, and maybe I'll find someone. The family we met who rescued Bauer, I mean, we connected with them first on Facebook. There's like a little Røvi community Facebook page, and we just wrote there, "Hey, we're writing about Bauer," and that's how the family got in touch.
My final question touches on what you just said. How much can we know about what people knew or thought? No? And I was going back to your lecture, and you brought us to these key moments in Bauer's life, as you have told us. And I think I find it highly fascinating to stop there and to just think about that, his camp experience and the dangers of escape. And then I asked myself, and you probably have asked yourself the same question: where is the line? What we know and what we cannot know. Where is it? Where is what we write about is based on facts, and where it starts to be an experiment of imagination, where and there's I think that is a very difficult but a very also fascinating work to see where the scale goes and how to evaluate certain hints that you get in letters and so on to put together a puzzle. No? And maybe that's really my final question, but maybe you can tell us about how you do that.
Yeah, well, I think that's such a good question. I mean, when I sort of began using narrative nonfiction to write, it was to tell the story of Witold Pilecki, who volunteered for Auschwitz, and he wrote a preface to his report that he wrote in 1945 about his experience in the camp, in which he said, "Everything I've written in this report is true to the best of my knowledge, because to write a single falsehood would be to dishonor the memories of all my fallen friends." And I think it's never far from my mind that I am writing a book about the Holocaust, and I do not agree with the fictionalization of the Holocaust in at all. It does not seem appropriate to me or right. Having got to speak to survivors, having spent days and weeks and months reading survivor accounts. So for me, every detail has to be grounded in a source for the book, which is recorded in the very voluminous endnotes, which basically, like, there's a citation for every single sentence, really. What I would say, though, which is what I think is sort of different to a sort of classic historical approach and the narrative nonfiction one, is there is a sort of idea that you can reconstruct a scene based on the memories of people who were there. And I think for me, this felt, I mean, maybe because of my background as a journalist, and I sort of would show up in places and say, "Tell me what happened," and then write the story, obviously with, the sort of caveats that you have. Bauer's Heuberg experience, I mean, we have dozens of survivor accounts describing what it was like in that camp, and so some of them are speaking very specifically about Block 19A, or the weather on the particular day of Bauer's arrival, what the camp commandant was wearing on that day of his arrival. And that, for me, allows for reconstruction. Now, I'm assuming that these survivors are, to the best of their knowledge, like Pilecki, telling the truth. And that's an assumption that I make. But I think it's sort of justified in the telling of Holocaust history because, in fact, Bauer himself, I mean, to try the defendants for the Auschwitz trial, I mean, they had some factual documents, but really it came down to believing what the survivors had to say. And, you know, this was actually awkward for the German justice system. It was awkward for many of the judges and prosecutors who felt that, as Hofmeier, the judge in the trial, said, that witness testimony is the lowest form of evidence. But I don't feel that way. I feel it's, in fact, as important as an SS document for helping us reveal the truth. And that's very much informs my approach to narrative nonfiction, that we can use survivor accounts, that we can use non-conventional sources, if you like, in order to create these scenes. And that's what Bauer himself had to do. And so long as we, sort of are respecting that source material, then we can, I think, steer honestly through this material. And I try in the end notes to sort of explain, or I will do once they're finished for the summer, try and explain like how these scenes are built, and leave it for the reader to decide.
Excellent closing statement. Thank you very much, Dick Fairweather, for being with us. Thank you for your patience and your questions. Thank you.